Maxwell Rothschild stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the sun set behind Chicago's magnificent skyline. At 52, he'd built Goldcrest Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it into one of the city's most prestigious financial consulting firms. The view from the 84th floor never failed to remind him of his success and the power that came with it. His attention was drawn to movement in the office across from his. The janitor had arrived, right on schedule. Maxwell had noticed him before, a man probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of years of manual labor. There was something about the way he worked that irritated Maxwell. The man took pride in his work, whistling as he emptied trash bins and cleaned windows, as if he wasn't at the bottom of the corporate ladder. "Mr. Rothschild," his assistant's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The budget reports you requested." Maxwell turned, taking the folder without acknowledging her. His eyes caught the cleaning cart passing by his office door. The janitor, James Wilson, according to his name tag, nodded respectfully as he passed. Maxwell ignored him, returning to the reports. The numbers weren't good. The maintenance budget had increased by 12% over the last quarter. Maxwell drummed his fingers on his mahogany desk, his jaw tightening. In his world, inefficiency was unforgivable. "Get me Harrison from facilities," he ordered through the intercom. Within minutes, the facilities manager appeared, looking nervous. "These maintenance costs are unacceptable," Maxwell said without preamble. "I want a complete audit of all cleaning staff, hours, supplies, everything. I want to know who's efficient and who's dead weight." "Sir, our cleaning staff is already working at maximum capacity," Harrison protested weakly. "If anything, they're understaffed." "I don't want excuses," Maxwell cut him off. "I want results. Start with that one." He gestured toward James, who was carefully cleaning the glass walls of a conference room. "He spends too much time on each task. I've watched him. It's inefficient." Harrison hesitated. "James Wilson? But sir, he's one of our best workers. His attention to detail is costing us money," Maxwell finished. "I want that audit on my desk by Friday." After Harrison left, Maxwell returned to the window. The city lights were coming on, creating a tapestry of illumination against the darkening sky. He'd worked too hard, come too far, to let sentimentality affect business decisions. Efficiency was everything. It was how he'd built his empire. Later that evening, as Maxwell gathered his things to leave, he noticed James still working, carefully wiping down door handles and light switches. The man's thoroughness was almost obsessive. Maxwell shook his head in disgust. This was why some people never rose above their station. They couldn't see the bigger picture. The elevator ride down was silent, Maxwell absorbed in his phone. In the lobby, he nearly collided with someone, James, carrying a bag of trash. The janitor apologized, stepping aside quickly, but not before Maxwell caught a glimpse of something that made him pause. Under the fluorescent lights of the lobby, he saw that James's shoes, though clean, were heavily worn, the kind of wear that comes from choosing to repair rather than replace. Something about those shoes bothered Maxwell as he walked to his waiting car. He'd grown up poor himself, fought his way out of a neighborhood where dreams went to die. He'd learned early that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Success required ruthlessness, efficiency, and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. But as his driver pulled away from the curb, Maxwell found himself looking back at the building. Through the lobby windows, he could see James methodically cleaning the marble floors. His reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces. The man worked as if he were tending to a cathedral rather than an office building. Maxwell turned away, irritated by his own momentary weakness. Tomorrow, he decided, he would tell Harrison to speed up that audit. In business, there was no room for inefficiency, no matter how dedicated the worker might appear to be. What Maxwell didn't know was that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would force him to question everything he believed about success, worth, and the true measure of a man's value. The truth about James Wilson would soon shatter Maxwell's carefully constructed worldview, leaving him to grapple with questions he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. As his car merged into the evening traffic, Maxwell pushed thoughts of the janitor aside. He had a dinner meeting with potential investors, and he needed to focus. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of those worn shoes persisted, like a small crack in the foundation of his certainty. The next morning would bring revelations that would make Maxwell Rothschild question not just his judgment of James Wilson, but the very principles upon which he'd built his empire. But for now, he remained unaware that his life was about to change dramatically, all because of a janitor he'd deemed inefficient. The following morning, Maxwell arrived at his office earlier than usual. The sky was still tinged with dawn's purple hue as he stepped out of the elevator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He'd spent a restless night, thoughts of the maintenance audit and that peculiar janitor interrupting his usually sound sleep. The office was quiet, empty except for the early morning cleaning crew finishing their shift. As Maxwell rounded the corner to his office, he heard voices coming from the break room, a conversation not meant for his ears. "James, you've got to slow down," a woman's voice said, concern evident in her tone. "Working these double shifts isn't healthy." "I don't have a choice, Maria." James's voice was tired but determined. "Sarah's medical school tuition is due next week, and Michael's engineering program isn't getting any cheaper. And with Emily starting pre-law this fall." Maxwell froze mid-step. Medical school, engineering, pre-law. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing. "But 3 jobs, Maria protested. "The night shift here, mornings at the hospital and weekends at the warehouse. When do you sleep?" "Sleep is a luxury I can't afford right now," James replied with a quiet laugh. "Besides, they're all doing so well. Sarah's at the top of her class at Northwestern Medical School. Michael's internship at Boeing is going amazing. And Emily, you should see her eyes light up when she talks about becoming a public defender. My kids are going to have opportunities I never had." Maxwell found himself holding his breath, his hand gripping his briefcase too tightly. The pride in James's voice was unmistakable, the same pride he'd mistaken for simple-mindedness in the man's attention to detail. "And they help out too," James continued. "Sarah's got a part-time research position, Michael tutors engineering students, and Emily works at the library. We make it work somehow. After their mother passed away, I promised her I'd make sure they got the education they deserved." Maxwell backed away quietly, his mind racing. He walked to his office on autopilot, barely noticing when his assistant greeted him. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and began typing. Within minutes, he'd pulled up the employee records for James Wilson. The file told a story that made his chest tighten. 15 years of service, perfect attendance, glowing performance reviews, not a single complaint. But it was the emergency contact information that caught his eye. Sarah Wilson, Northwestern Medical School; Michael Wilson, Illinois Institute of Technology; Emily Wilson, DePaul University. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back unbidden. His own father, who'd worked 3 jobs to put food on the table. The shame he'd felt wearing second-hand clothes. The burn of determination that had driven him to climb out of poverty. Somewhere along the way, he'd buried those memories, replaced them with spreadsheets and profit margins. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Harrison, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, about that audit. The maintenance audit?" "Yes." Maxwell's voice was sharper than he'd intended. "Well, we've started reviewing the staff schedules and efficiency metrics. James Wilson's numbers, they're actually quite remarkable. He covers more square footage than any other cleaner, with the highest quality ratings. He's developed several cost-saving methods for supply usage." "And that's enough," Maxwell cut him off, standing abruptly. "Cancel the audit." "Sir, I said cancel it. And Harrison, I want you to look into something else for me. Pull together information about our employee tuition assistance program. All the details." "But sir, we don't have a tuition assistance program." Maxwell turned to look out his window, his jaw set in a firm line. "We do now." After Harrison left, Maxwell remained at the window, watching the morning sun reflect off neighboring buildings. He thought about James Wilson's worn shoes, his careful attention to detail, the pride in his voice when speaking about his children. He thought about the kind of determination it took to work 3 jobs, the kind of love that would sacrifice sleep and comfort to give your children a better future. The sound of a cleaning cart in the hallway drew his attention. James was finishing his morning shift, methodically working his way through his routine. Maxwell watched him through the glass walls, seeing him with new eyes. Every careful movement, every thorough cleaning, it wasn't inefficiency at all. It was dignity, pride, the same qualities that had driven Maxwell himself to succeed, manifested in a different way. But this realization was just the beginning. What Maxwell would discover next about James Wilson and his family would shake him to his core, forcing him to confront not just his prejudices, but the very foundation of his beliefs about success and worth. The true test of his character lay ahead, and the decisions he would make in the coming days would have far-reaching consequences for both men. Maxwell spent the next week observing James from a distance, while simultaneously working to establish the company's new tuition assistance program. He found himself arriving earlier each morning, staying later each evening, watching the janitor, who'd unwittingly turned his worldview upside down. One evening, as the office emptied and the cleaning crew began their rounds, Maxwell made a decision. He waited until James reached his office, then stepped out into the hallway. "Mr. Wilson," he called out, "a moment of your time, please." James looked surprised, but nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mr. Rothschild." Maxwell gestured for him to enter the office, closing the door behind them. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around James's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of too many hours working and too few hours sleeping. "How long have you been working 3 jobs, Mr. Wilson?" Maxwell asked directly. James's eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, This isn't a reprimand," Maxwell interrupted, softening his tone. "Please sit down." James settled cautiously into one of the leather chairs facing Maxwell's desk. "It's been about 5 years now," he admitted, "since my wife passed away." "Tell me about your children," Maxwell said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. A smile transformed James's tired face. "They're extraordinary, Mr. Rothschild. Sarah, my oldest, she's always wanted to be a doctor. Ever since she was little, always taking care of stray animals, bandaging her siblings' scrapes. Michael, he can build anything, gets that from his mother. And Emily," his voice caught slightly. "Emily's just like her mother too. Such a strong sense of justice." Maxwell nodded, thinking of the file he'd had Harrison compile. Sarah Wilson was indeed at the top of her class at Northwestern Medical School, specializing in pediatric oncology. Michael had already been offered a post-graduation position at Boeing, based on his innovative internship work, and Emily's academic records at DePaul were exemplary. "Your wife," Maxwell said carefully. "What was her name?" "Margaret," James replied softly. Everyone called her Maggie. Maxwell felt his heart stop for a moment. "Margaret Wilson from St. Mary's Hospital." James looked up sharply. "Yes, she was a nurse there for 20 years. Did you know her?" Maxwell's hands gripped the edge of his desk. "Mr. Wilson, 5 years ago, there was a nurse. She stayed with my mother during her final days in the oncology ward. She was the only one who could make my mother smile, who treated her with such dignity." James's eyes filled with recognition. "Your mother, Mrs. Eleanor Rothschild." He shook his head in amazement. "Maggie talked about her often. She said Mrs. Rothschild reminded her of her own mother. So elegant, even in illness." Maxwell stood abruptly, walking to the window to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Your wife, she was there the night my mother passed away. She held my hand and told me that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go." The silence in the office was heavy with shared memory. Maxwell turned back to face James, seeing him in yet another new light. This man's wife had given him comfort during one of the darkest moments of his life, and here he'd been, planning to scrutinize the efficiency of her widowed husband's cleaning routine. "Mr. Wilson," Maxwell began, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm implementing a new company policy, a tuition assistance program for employees and their children. It's retroactive for the current academic year." James stared at him, uncomprehending. "Sir, your children's tuition will be covered, all of it. Consider it a long overdue thank you for what your wife did for my family." James stood shakily. "Mr. Rothschild, I can't accept—" "You can, and you will," Maxwell said firmly. "And you're going to quit those other jobs. I'm promoting you to Facilities Management Supervisor, effective immediately. The salary will more than compensate for the income you'll be losing." Tears welled in James's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll get some sleep," Maxwell replied, attempting a smile. "You look like hell, Wilson." But as James left his office that evening, visibly overwhelmed by this sudden turn of events, Maxwell knew there was more to this story that needed to be told. The connection between their families wasn't just a coincidence. It was about to lead to an even more astounding discovery, one that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about their shared past. The following Sunday, Maxwell found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, visiting his mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet as he made his way through the rows of headstones. He carried a bouquet of white lilies, his mother's favorite. As he approached his mother's plot, he stopped short. Someone was already there, a young woman in a white medical coat, placing fresh flowers on the grave. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and Maxwell felt his breath catch. She had Maggie Wilson's eyes. "Dr. Wilson," he said softly, recognizing Sarah from the photos in her file. She smiled, though her eyes were damp. "Mr. Rothschild, Dad told us what you did for our family. I wanted to pay my respects to Mrs. Rothschild. Mom used to bring us here sometimes after she passed. She said Mrs. Rothschild reminded her of someone very special." Maxwell stepped forward, placing his lilies next to Sarah's flowers. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman. She made my mother's last days bearable." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "Mom always said that Mrs. Rothschild gave her hope during a really dark time in her life. It was right after she lost her best friend, Catherine. They were nurses together at County before Mom moved to St. Mary's." Maxwell froze. "Catherine? Catherine Martinez?" "Yes." Sarah looked surprised. "Did you know her?" Maxwell's world tilted on its axis. "Catherine Martinez was my mother's best friend from college. They were like sisters. She was my godmother." Sarah's eyes widened. "Mom had a photo of them together. Mrs. Rothschild and Catherine at some garden party. She kept it in her jewelry box." "The garden party," Maxwell whispered. "At my parents' summer house. I was there. I must have been about 5. There was a little girl there, Catherine's goddaughter." "That was my mom," Sarah said softly. "Margaret Wheeler back then. She was Catherine's goddaughter. Mom used to tell us stories about that day, about playing in the garden with a little boy who showed her how to catch butterflies." Maxwell felt his legs go weak. He sat heavily on a nearby bench, memories flooding back. A summer day filled with laughter. A little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, teaching her how to cup her hands just right to catch butterflies without hurting them. "Our mothers were connected," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "all this time. And now here we are, decades later." "Mom believed that nothing in life was coincidence," Sarah said, sitting beside him. "She said every connection was a thread in a larger tapestry." Maxwell thought about James, working 3 jobs to give his children a better future. He thought about Maggie, caring for his mother with such compassion. He thought about his own mother and Catherine, their friendship reaching across generations to bring 2 families together again. "Mr. Rothschild," Sarah hesitated, then continued, "there's something else you should know. I chose pediatric oncology because of Mrs. Rothschild. Mom used to tell us about her grace, her strength, how she never lost her kindness, even in pain. She inspired me to want to help other families facing cancer." Maxwell felt tears sliding down his cheeks. But for once, he didn't try to hide them. "Sarah, would you Would you tell me more about your mother, about the years I missed?" They sat there as the afternoon faded, sharing stories that bridged past and present. Sarah told him about growing up with Maggie's stories of Catherine and Eleanor, about how her mother's connection to these women had shaped her own life's path. Maxwell shared memories of that long-ago garden party, of Catherine's visits, of the way his mother and her friend had created a circle of love that still rippled outward. But even as they talked, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one more revelation waiting to emerge, one that would complete this circle in a way none of them could have imagined. The next day would bring a discovery in his mother's old papers that would transform this reconnection into something even more profound, touching not just the past, but the future of both families. The next morning, Maxwell arrived at his office earlier than usual, carrying a weathered box he'd retrieved from his attic. Inside were his mother's personal papers, letters, photographs, and journals he hadn't had the heart to look through after her passing. But his conversation with Sarah had awakened something in him, a need to understand the full extent of these interconnected lives. As he sorted through the papers, his hands trembled upon finding an envelope marked, "For Maxwell, when you're ready to understand." His mother's elegant handwriting brought tears to his eyes. Inside, he found a letter dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Maxwell," it began, "if you're reading this, I pray you've finally opened your heart to the truth I've always tried to teach you, that a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or status, but by the lives they touch and the love they share." Maxwell had to pause, overwhelmed by his mother's words. When he continued reading, what he discovered made his heart stop. The letter revealed that Catherine Martinez and Maggie Wheeler, James's late wife, hadn't just been godmother and goddaughter. They had been instrumental in saving his family's fortune during a crucial moment in his childhood. His father had faced bankruptcy, and it was Catherine's financial expertise and Maggie's father's legal counsel that had helped them rebuild. His mother had never told him, knowing his pride might make him see it as charity rather than the beautiful collaboration it was. "The wealth you've built your life around," his mother wrote, "exists in part because of the kindness of people you might now consider beneath you. Remember this, my son, true legacy isn't in the money we accumulate, but in the kindness we pass forward." Maxwell sat back in his chair, his mother's words echoing in his mind. All these years, he'd prided himself on being self-made, never knowing that his very foundation had been built on the kindness of others. And now, life had brought him full circle, giving him the opportunity to help the family that had once helped his own. He reached for his phone, calling Harrison. "Get James Wilson and his children here this afternoon, all of them. And contact our legal team. I want the Scholarship Foundation documents ready." By late afternoon, the Wilsons gathered in Maxwell's office. James, Sarah, Michael, and Emily. They sat together as Maxwell shared his mother's letter, watching their faces as they discovered this long-buried connection between their families. "This isn't just about tuition anymore," Maxwell explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm establishing the Eleanor Rothschild Catherine Martinez Memorial Scholarship Foundation. It will provide full educational funding for children of service workers, starting with hospital staff and maintenance workers. And I want your family to help run it." James looked stunned. "Mr. Rothschild." "Maxwell," he corrected gently. "Please, we've been connected for far too long to stand on formality now." Emily, James's youngest, spoke up. "This is why I want to be a public defender," she said softly. "Mum always taught us that everyone deserves a chance to be heard, to be seen for who they really are." "Your mother was wiser than I've been," Maxwell admitted. "I've spent years judging people based on their titles, their positions. I forgot what my own mother tried to teach me, that true worth isn't in what we own, but in what we give." Sarah reached over and squeezed her father's hand. "Dad never forgot that. Even when working 3 jobs, he always found ways to help others. He taught us that dignity isn't about what you do, but how you do it." Maxwell looked at James, really looked at him, and saw what he'd missed before. The quiet strength, the unwavering integrity, the deep wisdom that no business school could teach. Here was a man who had succeeded in the ways that truly mattered, raising children who understood the value of education, hard work, and compassion. "I've been thinking about something else," Maxwell said. "Goldcrest Enterprises has gotten away from what matters most, the people who make it work. I want to create an employee advocacy program. And James, I want you to lead it. You understand what our workers need better than any consultant ever could." Over the next few months, the changes at Goldcrest became the talk of the business world. The Scholarship Foundation flourished, helping dozens of families achieve their educational dreams. The Employee Advocacy Program transformed company culture, creating a model other corporations sought to emulate. But the real transformation was more personal. Maxwell found himself spending Sunday afternoons with the Wilsons, sharing meals and stories, watching as their families' past connections wove into present bonds. He attended Sarah's medical school graduation, cheered at Michael's engineering awards ceremony, and sat proudly at Emily's law school acceptance celebration. One evening, as Maxwell left the office, he passed a new janitor, carefully cleaning the lobby windows. He stopped, introduced himself, and asked about the young man's family. As he listened to the janitor's stories about his children's dreams, Maxwell smiled, remembering his mother's words about the true measure of a person's worth. He had learned that success wasn't just about climbing higher. It was about reaching back to help others up. That true wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch. That every person, regardless of their job title, carried within them dreams, dignity, and the potential to change lives. Most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from those we least expect to teach us. That beneath the surface of every life lies a story worth knowing, and that judgment without understanding is the poorest investment a person can make. As Maxwell walked to his car that evening, he looked back at the building where his journey of understanding had begun. The lights inside illuminated workers of all kinds, executives, cleaners, security guards, each contributing to something larger than themselves. In that moment, he understood what his mother had always known, that we are all connected in an intricate tapestry of lives, and that true success lies not in the height we reach, but in the lives we lift as we climb. What would have happened if Maxwell had never discovered the truth about James and his family? How many incredible stories are we missing out on by judging others without truly knowing them? Have you ever had a moment in your life where someone completely surprised you, showing you that your initial prejudices were wrong? How did that change your perspective? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like. It's the best way to help us share these messages of hope and transformation with more people. To your left, you'll find a story that will make you question everything you believe about the power of love and redemption. We assure you that, like this story, it will leave your heart full and give you a new perspective on life. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon. Your support enables us to keep sharing stories that inspire and transform lives every day. Together, we are building a community that celebrates the power of compassion and true human connection.